You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey there, I'm Travis Hoyam, one of the hosts of Motley Fool Hidden Gems Investing. Each weekday on Motley Fool Hidden Gems Investing, we talk through the business news you need to know and the stories moving stocks on Wall Street. On weekends, we game plan personal finance strategies and dive into the industries shaping tomorrow and host the experts, authors, and executives that understand them. Tune in for insights and a long-term perspective on investing and, of course, stock ideas, plenty of them. To quote a listener, it pays to listen. Check us out and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
The Fox sisters, Leah, Margaretta, and Catherine, the younger two called informally Maggie and Kate, grew up in a little farmhouse in Ontario, Canada. But in 1847, they moved to Hydesville, New York, a small rural village in Wayne County, just north of Newark. Likely the move was to be closer to the eldest sister, Leah, who had married a man named Fish and lived in Rochester. Their parents were simple folk, hardworking Methodists, though their mother proved to be somewhat superstitious. The old house into which they'd moved made noises, the creaking and popping of any wooden house certainly, but also thumping sounds that she was certain were not natural. And they seemed always to be heard near her two little girls, Maggie and Kate, who were 12 and 10 years old, respectively. She heard thumping from their room at night, but when she investigated, she found them in their beds. Soon the phenomenon manifested even during the daytime, and away from their bedroom, a strange knocking sound, almost as if someone or something was trying to signal them or communicate in some way. It became an obsession, something that she brooded on night and day, and eventually spoke about with neighbors. Curious, they came to the house to hear for themselves the knocking sounds that followed the girls from room to room. And they suggested what the girl's mother had been afraid to suggest herself, that the house was haunted. The notion took hold of her then that a quote-unquote disembodied spirit was following her children and may even intend to possess them. The girls called it Mr. Splitfoot, a common name for a cloven-hoofed devil, and it seemed to know things about them. When asked to knock the number of their ages, it obliged. A code was devised to communicate with the spirit, a knock of once for yes, and twice for no, and even a knock of certain numbers to correspond with letters and thereby spell out words. So a question was put to the spirit: had someone been murdered in the house? And the knocks, or as they were called, rappings, answered yes. All the simple folks of Hydesville had by then heard of the rappings, and rumors swirled about the murder that must have taken place in the house. A certain unpopular man in the village, named Bell, became the favorite suspect, and the coded rappings encouraged the belief, filling out the story. The spirit was not the devil, but rather a traveling peddler named Charles Rosma, who was killed there for his money 5 years ago and buried in the cellar. All of Hydesville called Bell a murderer and made of him a pariah. Meanwhile, the Fox sisters were sent away from that haunted house and all the hubbub surrounding it, off to Rochester to stay with their sister, Leah Fish. But soon word spread that the rappings followed them, even when they were separated. There in Rochester, their older sister didn't shelter them from further scrutiny, but rather promoted their communication with the spirit that had followed them. Crowds of visitors came to see them and hear the Rochester rappings, and to have their questions answered by one who had passed beyond the veil for a small admission fee. They reportedly took in as much as $150 in a single night, all of which their older sister kept for herself. But through these exhibitions, the notion of such communication with the dead and of the role that the girls played as conduits, the mediums through which the communication occurred, was spreading. specifically among already radical religious groups in an area known for the birth of new religions. What they were witness to was the birth of yet another unique American religion, one informed by mystical trends in modern Christianity, inspired by pseudoscience, and predicated on hoax and fraud. This is Historical Blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and I'm asking you, disembodied listeners out there, whether you're interested in this topic, which has for so long fascinated me. Knock once for yes and twice for no. I hear you loud and clear. Yes, yes. Thank you for listening to Common Séance, a history of spiritualism, Part 1, The Fox Sisters, Rap Artists. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of my patrons on Patreon and encourage listeners to pledge support on Patreon, as I've been losing patrons there and have not seen new patronage in a while. I'm not sure why, but support from listeners like you on Patreon is what makes it possible for me to devote as much time as I do to the podcast. I love making the show. It's fun to make, and I'm proud of what I do in it. But also recently, my academic career has faltered a bit, and my income has taken a hit. So I'm hoping to bolster listenership to this podcast and maybe bring it to a point where I can earn a little more from it, so that I have a good excuse to keep devoting time to it. Patrons of the show get access to an exclusive RSS feed with ad-free versions of the show, early release of episodes, teasers, and exclusive minisodes between every main release, making this a weekly podcast for patrons. If you hear minisodes and think they're little blurbs or insubstantial sound bites, think again. They're fully researched and produced episodes, anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes long, and they tie in with the main episode topics. And they even sometimes fill in the gaps and tell the rest of the story that my main episode didn't have time to tell. For example, after my episode on flat earthers, I revealed more about the medical quackery and snake oil salesmanship of the first modern flat earther. And after the second part, I gave a clearer overview of how flat earthism took root in America. For listeners who are interested, I also sell these exclusive minisodes for just $3 a pop. So head over to patreon.com/historicalblindness and consider purchasing the occasional blind spot minisode that interests you, or supporting the podcast for as little as $1 a month. Now, let's continue the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. If you're a Patreon supporter, you already know the connection between flat earthism and spiritualism, and why I was led to tackle this topic next after my two-parter on the history of flat earth theory. But for those who don't support the podcast, it's pretty simple. They arose at really the same time. True believers, of course, will claim that spiritualism and mediumship can be traced much further back into antiquity in the form of necromancy or divination of the dead. And certainly that connection is pretty clear. In ancient Egypt and ancient China, there was belief in the persistence of the spirit after death. In Egypt, communication with the dead happened in dreams or through the texts they left in tombs, whereas in China, it was thought that one could earn the guidance and protection of the dead through filial piety and ancestor veneration. They too wrote letters to the dead and burned them in order to deliver them into the afterlife. And as did many other cultures, they had shamans who were thought capable of more direct communication through ritual divination involving the reading of animal bones, which they heated with hot pokers until they cracked and interpreted the cracks as messages from beyond. In ancient Greece, we see a more direct parallel in the oracles of the dead, sacred sites where pilgrims traveled to speak to their deceased ancestors. At these temples, we find that visitors fasted, consumed hallucinogens, and wandered through dark corridors and crypts, offering animal sacrifices until they had visionary experiences. And their visions were even directed by priests who led them through the symbolic gates of Hades and contrived to induce their visions through mechanical props and lantern shows. So if we trace spiritualism back to these ancient practices, we still see mediums engaged in trickery. Likewise, the most popular example of the antiquity of mediumship from the story of King Saul and the Witch of Endor raises some interesting questions about the trickery of necromancers. This story, which Bible scholars consider a theological narrative rather than a historical event, appears in 1 Samuel, relating how Saul, the first king of Israel, had outlawed all necromancy but nevertheless consulted a necromancer when in need of guidance. This witch he consulted supposedly summoned the shade of the prophet Samuel for the king. Some translations even use the word medium to describe the woman he consulted, though this word was not used in this sense until the 1850s, after the Fox sisters and the advent of spiritualism. Interestingly, a close reading of this incident makes clear that Saul actually saw nothing, and this medium from Endor simply described something to him. Quote, "I see a divine being coming up out of the ground," end quote, she says, and Saul asks, quote, "What is his appearance?" end quote. She describes an old man in a robe to him, and he is convinced the woman has summoned the prophet. After that, it's narrated as if Saul speaks directly to the spirit of Samuel, but this beginning makes it clear that he's only speaking to the woman, who relays the supposed spirit's words. What this makes clear is that proponents of spiritualism and mediumship who raise these ancient examples to legitimize the practice are really only showing that fraudsters have been claiming to speak with the dead and fooling people into thinking they've encountered spirits since time immemorial. As asserted above, spiritualism proper really did start with the Fox sisters in the 1840s, during the same year that Samuel Rowbotham was lecturing about the flat earth in England. And as their brand of modern spirit communication spread across America, so too was the belief in a flat earth spreading, sometimes promoted by the same people, as discussed in my most recent Patreon exclusive. Spiritualism in particular emerged out of very fertile ground for fringe religious ideas, the burned-over district of Western New York. I spoke about this region in my episode on the failed doomsday predictions of millennialist sects earlier this year. It was in this region that William Miller first predicted the end of the world, just a few years before the Fox family started hearing raps in their farmhouse. After the Great Disappointment, Ellen White, a central organizer of the Seventh-day Adventist movement that evolved from the Millerite movement, claimed to be having visions while in a trance-like state. Throughout her life, she claimed to have had hundreds of such visions. Meanwhile, as the spiritualism movement developed, so too the Fox sisters and the numerous other mediums who afterward cropped up claiming the same powers as them began to experience trance states while supposedly communicating with the dead. Indeed, they even had an example from a neighboring village of a new religion based on revelation obtained in a trance. In the same county, only about 6 miles east of the Fox farmhouse, young Joseph Smith had claimed the ability to find hidden treasure through divination, and later claimed to have been led by an angel to a new Bible inscribed on golden plates, which he purported to translate through a trance. Indeed, trances in mystical religious experience and pseudoscience had become popular over the last 100 years. It began far from Western New York, in Sweden, in 1745, when scientist and philosopher Emanuel Swedenborg first began having religious visions and dabbling in mysticism. Like Ellen White would do a century later, he claimed to suspend his breathing and experience intense visions while in a wakeful state. In fact, Swedenborg claimed to actually leave his body and interact with the spiritual realm in what would later be called astral projection. While having these out-of-body experiences, he claimed to interact with angelic beings, to travel to other worlds, and encounter extraterrestrials, and, more germane for our topic, to communicate with the spirits of the dead. A skeptic might remark on the fact that he became more and more relaxed about these trances and out-of-body experiences, claiming after a while to be able to see spirits even while walking around town, saying he saw spirits reacting to the smell of horse dung, or expressing displeasure at how he buttered his bread or the kind of tea he drank. To me, this reeks of embellishment. It's well known that chronic liars tend to escalate, and that is what we see here, with Swedenborg eventually portraying himself like an 18th century Lydia Dietz from Beetlejuice, seeing dead people everywhere. But stories like these, The Ghost Whisperer, The Sixth Sense, the television sitcom Ghosts, and my favorite, the stop-motion animated film Paranorman, owe everything to Swedenborg. In fact, our entire notion of ghosts as human spirits in an intermediary state, haunting the physical world before moving on to another plane of existence, seems to have come from Swedenborg, who imagined the spirit realm as a middle place where human spirits arrive after death before being sorted into heaven or hell. It is therefore to Swedenborg and his trances and communication with spirits that spiritualism owes everything. Even if the little Fox sisters knew nothing about him, their mother, who thought the house haunted, and their neighbors, who suggested a spirit was communicating with them, and their sister, who promoted them as having the special powers of mediumship, were all toying with ideas that Swedenborg had originated and popularized. Unlike Swedenborgianism and the quote-unquote religions besides itself that emerged in the burned-over district, spiritualism did not necessarily present itself as a religious movement. In fact, it developed a veneer of scientific credibility, and that is largely because of the other major historical influence on it, the pseudoscience of mesmerism. Later in the 18th century, a couple of years after Swedenborg's death, a German doctor named Franz Mesmer claimed to have cured a woman of her cyclical delirium and paralysis through the application of magnets. He promoted this as proof of his quote-unquote animal magnetism theory, that blockages in the circulation of some mysterious magnetic fluid within the body could be blamed for most illnesses. As he developed his claims, he came to assert that he could manipulate these fluids not only with magnets, but also with magnetically charged wands, with sweeps of his hands over patients' bodies, and even just by staring intensely. His career as a miracle worker suffered an early blow when he was hired to restore the sight of Maria Theresia von Paradis, a young virtuosa pianist whose eyesight had failed at a young age. It's unclear exactly what transpired. Some suspect that Mesmer detected that Paradis did have some remaining eyesight and encouraged her to demonstrate it, or that he actually convinced her to fake a restoration of sight. But it seemed for a short while that he had cured her sight before her blindness returned and she suffered an emotional collapse. The result was that Mesmer was branded a charlatan in the medical community and had to flee Vienna. He thereafter set up a clinic in France, and his mesmeric sessions more and more took on an occult aspect. Participants would gather in dimly lit rooms, smoky with incense and creepy music from a glass harmonica. Mesmer took to wearing extravagant robes with occult symbols stitched into the fabric. Certainly there was an improper sexual element to these sessions, as Mesmer would sweep his hands over female patients or even touch them directly, and the women, likely due to the power of suggestion, would often convulse. Marie Antoinette herself became a frequent attendee of Mesmer's sessions and gave him extravagant sums of money, until the king directed a royal commission headed by Benjamin Franklin to investigate Mesmer in 1784. First, they determined that Mesmer had no actual evidence of the existence of this new bodily fluid he claimed to have discovered. Then, by blindfolding participants, they observed that patients only reported any effects from mesmeric passes or sweeps when they knew they were happening. Thus, they attributed its effects to the imagination, an early observation of the placebo effect. Nevertheless, mesmerism continued to be practiced well into the 19th century, and it came to influence the development of spiritualism. There are a number of ways that mesmerism's influence on spiritualism can be discerned. Mesmerists claimed to be especially sensitive individuals, uniquely capable of establishing a deep quote-unquote rapport with others, and spiritualist mediums would likewise claim to be sensitive to the spirits and capable of establishing rapport with them. Like Swedenborg before him, Mesmer taught that the human mind could enter a trance state, which he called, quote, magnetic somnambulism, end quote, and that in this trance, people were capable of supernatural abilities, like clairvoyance. Before evolving into the modern-day practice of hypnotism, mesmeric trances would be practiced or faked by mediums who claimed it allowed them to better act as conduits for the dead. And aside from their one-on-one sessions, mesmerists would also conduct group sessions. Participants would sit around a table in a Victorian drawing room, holding hands to create a circuit of energy as they tried to tune in to mysterious forces. This scene should be very familiar as a séance to anyone who has participated in one or even seen one in a film, and indeed, that is what they called it. The word séance means session in French, and thus at Mesmer's clinic in France, they were mesmeric or animal magnetism séances. And it's no coincidence that one early and major proponent of and influence on the spiritualism of the Fox sisters was himself a mesmerist. Now for a brief intermission. Now, back to the show. Andrew Jackson Davis was a rustic, unschooled youth of 17 years old, living in Poughkeepsie, New York, when he attended some lectures by a traveling mesmerist who managed to make him swoon into a trance and convinced him that he possessed great clairvoyant powers. Afterward, he claimed to have received a series of visions and messages, much like Swedenborg, and indeed, he even claimed to have encountered the spirit of Emanuel Swedenborg. Much like that other uneducated New York seer before him, Joseph Smith, he dictated an entire book while in a trance, called The Principles of Nature, Her Divine Revelations, and A Voice to Mankind. Later, it was observed that long passages of this dictation were simply plagiarized from Swedenborg. But to those who believed the Poughkeepsie seer, this just confirmed he'd been possessed by Emanuel Swedenborg himself. Andrew Jackson Davis is sometimes called the John the Baptist of spiritualism, in that he seems to have anticipated its rise, or even foretold it. In his first book, he wrote, quote, "It is a truth that spirits commune with one another while one is in the body and the other in the higher spheres. All the world will hail with delight the ushering in of that era when the interiors of men will be opened and the spiritual communication will be established," end quote. Later, after hearing about the Fox sisters' exhibitions in Rochester, he would claim that he'd had a premonition on the very day of the first rappings in Hydesville, and that he'd put down in his diary the cryptic words, quote, "A living demonstration is born," end quote. That certainly sounds a lot like retroactive myth-making, though, after Davis learned of the already growing spiritualist movement and glommed onto it, inviting the Fox sisters to his New York City home and seizing for himself a lead role in their burgeoning cause. Almost immediately, he set about writing, or perhaps he would have said channeling, books on spiritualism, including The Philosophy of Spiritual Intercourse, being an explanation of modern mysteries. Also influential on the development of spiritualism as a movement was the radical reform movement, and this may be due to another group of early supporters who promoted the Fox Sisters exhibitions even before Andrew Jackson Davis invited them out to New York City. During their early days in Rochester, when their sister Leah was just starting to charge money for the exhibition of their spirit communications, some family friends, Isaac and Amy Post, took the girls into their home and imparted some of their radical political beliefs. The Posts were Quakers, or more specifically, Hicksites, a branch of the Society of Friends renowned for their social reform activism. Like other Hicksites, the Posts believed strongly in abolition, temperance, prison reform, and, importantly, equal rights for women. The core of early believers in the Fox Sisters' ability to communicate with the dead were other radical, reform-minded friends of the Posts in Rochester, and this would end up becoming a major aspect of spiritualism. Isaac Post would himself end up becoming a medium and claiming to have been in contact with famous ghosts like Ben Franklin. But largely the field of mediumship was dominated by women, following the example of the Fox Sisters. This made sense to a society that already viewed women as more sensitive, more passive and submissive, and thus more yielding as conduits or vessels for spirits. And yet, for the women of America, who were otherwise denied a voice in the public sphere, pretending to channel the voice of some spirit offered a loophole through which women were able to express themselves and their political opinions. As the popularity of spiritualism rose, more and more these women, acting as mediums, found themselves consulted by powerful and important men. It allowed them to speak their minds, to act quote-unquote unladylike. And more than that, these mediums sometimes divorced their husbands, at the direction of the spirits, of course, and found financial independence by charging money for their services. It was a career that the Fox Sisters first proved viable, taking their exhibitions by 1849 to the biggest auditorium in Rochester and charging a crowd of some 400 people to watch as they asked the spirits questions and received coded rappings in reply. If they could do it, so could other women, and soon many did. This connection between spiritualism and women's independence and equal rights would eventually reach its zenith more than 20 years later, when one former magnetic healer turned spiritualist medium named Victoria Woodhull, dubbed Mrs. Satan in the press, actually ran for president on a platform of labor reform, women's rights, and free love. In the early exhibitions of the Fox Sisters' mediumship, the entire affair was treated rather lightheartedly. They were asked to make stock market predictions and to give advice on the attendees' love lives. Soon after their career as mediums took off, the spirit of the peddler supposedly murdered in their house vanished, and instead the rappings heard at their exhibitions were claimed to be from the dead friends and loved ones of audience members who asked questions. As the exhibitions grew in popularity and came to be taken more seriously, so too skepticism grew. More than one investigative committee was formed to determine whether the girls were knocking on things themselves or producing the knocking through some kind of ventriloquism. At one point, they even made the sisters stand on pillows, yet still the rappings could be heard. Some early skeptics, an assemblage of doctors from University of Buffalo in 1851, claimed the girls made the rapping sounds by popping their knee joints. But most of their early examiners came away convinced that the sounds could not have been caused by the sisters. One early ally and promoter of the authenticity of their mediumship was the editor of the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley, who claimed that the doctors from University of Buffalo were biased and had gone into their investigation expecting to find an anatomical source for the rappings. It was due to the early promotion of Andrew Jackson Davis and Horace Greeley that the Fox sisters' career as entertainers really took off in New York, where that famous purveyor of spectacle and humbug, P.T. Barnum, recognized the money-making potential of their exhibitions and booked their performances at a hotel run by his cousin, just up Broadway from his legendary museum. It was these exhibitions that really brought national fame to the sisters and helped to spread the practice of mediumship generally. Now that they had entered show business, their seances became more and more showy. They still featured rappings as a way of communicating with the dead, but they also began to feature table tipping, table turning, and even table levitation, as well as automatic writing or slate writing, in which one of the sisters wrote out messages backward on a chalkboard while in a trance, supposedly channeling the writing of a spirit. Famous individuals attended, like the author James Fenimore Cooper and the governor of Wisconsin, Nathaniel Talmadge, and many audience members came away believers. One such believer was First Lady Jane Pierce, who had lost a young son in a train wreck in 1853. She personally hosted a séance at which the Fox sisters claimed to channel her deceased boy. Within the first few years, other copycat mediums appeared besides Andrew Jackson Davis and Isaac Post, each of them coincidentally able to perform all the same tricks, or rather claiming to be able to produce all the same spiritual effects. One of the first was Daniel Dunglass Hume, who held his first séance at the Connecticut home of the Hayden family in 1851, during which a table moved. D.D. Hume would go on to become one of the most famous of mediums, supposedly capable of the most impressive powers. And in fact, I produced a patron-exclusive mini-sode about him on Patreon some years ago. You can pledge support and go find that, or even purchase it for a few dollars and listen to it as an addendum to this episode. Mediumship seemed to spread like a disease in those days. The Fox sisters seemed to impart their powers to their Quaker host, Isaac Post, and likewise after Hume's séance at the Hayden home, the 25-year-old Maria Hayden also began to display the powers of a medium. Around a year or two later, she took her séances to London, advertising the astounding phenomenon of quote-unquote spirit telegraphy. And while she faced many critics among the city's intelligentsia, spiritualism inevitably took root in England as well, where tea and table turning became a common Victorian pastime, and many an English medium appeared to lead the country's séances. Meanwhile, back in the US, another First Lady had taken an interest in spiritualism. After her husband's inauguration as president, Mary Todd Lincoln, who, like Jane Pierce, had already lost one young son and would soon lose another, hosted numerous séances at the White House, some of which Abraham Lincoln attended, though to what degree the president actually subscribed to the claims of spiritualism is still a matter of debate. After the outbreak and great losses of the Civil War, the appeal and popularity of spiritualism only grew, for it offered so many families a hope that they might still communicate one last time with the sons and fathers killed in that terrible war. And indeed, in the United States, it was this war that sparked some of the greatest opposition to spiritualism. As I discussed in my recent Patron exclusive, some religious critics like Miles Grant suggested that it was not ghosts whom mediums communicated with, but rather demons, and that through their influence on powerful people like President Lincoln, they were leading the nation deliberately into chaos. There was no better evidence for this claim than the Civil War. It was well known that mediums and the spirits they claimed to converse with advocated for reforms that many religious conservatives felt would be harmful, such as women's rights and the emancipation of enslaved people. Now these critics could claim that their advocacy of abolition had influenced the president to start a war and incur a devastating loss of life, even though Lincoln didn't really start the war, and also clearly wasn't influenced in his actions by the Council of the Mediums his wife sometimes hosted. After the war, while resistance to spiritualism continued to grow among religious conservatives, it also grew among the educated and scientific-minded, as well as among those who knew a trick when they saw it. It had already begun in the 1850s with the university investigation into the Fox sisters, and as early as 1854, stage magicians began to lead the way in exposing the frauds of mediums. One early vaudeville act was that of the Davenport brothers, who had themselves tied up in a box with musical instruments that would be played supposedly by spirits when the box was shut. Magicians Harry Keller, John Henry Anderson, and John Neville Maskelyne all exposed their tricks over and over, which consisted only of escaping their bonds and playing the instruments themselves, of course. By the end of the war, P.T. Barnum, who certainly knew a fraud when he saw one, publicly charged that both the Fox sisters and the Davenports and other mediums were fakers in his book, The Humbugs of the World. But still many were taken in and believed in the reality of mediumship wholeheartedly, even men of reason and science. Among the most influential apologists of spiritualism who helped convince many of its veracity were Alfred Russel Wallace, the same scientist who had helped to fight against flat earthism, and William Crookes, a chemist and physicist who observed seances conducted by the Fox sisters and D.D. Hume and believed them genuine. In the 1870s, Crookes's credibility took a major hit when he conducted experiments on the medium Anna Eva Fay that convinced him of her clairvoyance. Afterward, stage mentalist Washington Irving Bishop, who had formerly worked with Fay, explained how she'd fooled him, and Fay herself even admitted to her fraud. In those years, besides stage magicians, investigative journalists also led the way. Ray Lancaster exposed the medium Henry Slade in the Times in 1876, showing how he swapped out hidden slates with pre-written messages to produce the effects of spirit writing. And Henry Labouchere launched the magazine Truth the following year, in which he regularly debunked mediums, along with all kinds of other fraud. The 1880s brought ever more comprehensive and scholarly debunkings of mediumship. In 1882, the British Society for Psychical Research was formed, and as I've indicated in numerous other episodes, such as my episode on the Rosenheim poltergeist and my episode on the Moberly-Jourdain incident, this organization was very much biased in favor of confirming supernatural phenomena, but they also frequently did good work in exposing frauds. Their bias can be clearly discerned in that they were organized at a conference of the British National Association of Spiritualists, and among their number was the already discredited William Crookes. However, the SPR's first president, Henry Sidgwick, who took a more cautiously skeptical, if sometimes credulous, approach to the phenomena, encouraged more scientific attempts at disproving or falsifying the claims of mediums, and as a result ended up exposing more than one major medium of engaging in fraud. Among the chief investigators and staunchest critics of mediums at the SPR at the time were Sidgwick's wife, Eleanor, the most vocal debunker of the Moberly-Jourdain incident discussed in a recent episode, as well as a stage magician named S.J. Davy and a psychology researcher named Richard Hodgson. Throughout the end of the century, they exposed many mediums in the pages of their society's journal, including Helena Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, about whom I'll have far more to say in part 2 of this series, famous slate writer Henry Slade, who had already been tried and convicted of fraud in England after Ray Lankester had exposed him, William Eglinton, another slate writer who was also caught faking levitation in the dark rooms where he conducted his seances, and even faking spirit manifestations, which were typically just accomplices in ghostly robes and fake beards. Rosina Thompson, who was caught with files on her seance participants, making it possible to seem like she knew things about them only a spirit might know. And most famously, the very successful, though many times exposed, Italian medium Eusebia Palladino, who was an expert at raising tables and moving objects with her feet and free hands so that seance participants really believed they were levitating. In the same years, at University of Pennsylvania, a wealthy donor had left a generous endowment to the university with the stipulation that they organize a commission to investigate spiritualism, in which the benefactor believed wholeheartedly. The university complied, organizing a 10-man commission of scholars and scientists who looked into numerous phenomena and tested several prominent mediums, including Henry Slade and Maggie Fox of the famous Fox sisters. Their investigation was conducted over about 4 years, starting in 1884, and culminated in the publication of an 1887 report, which concluded that in every case they examined, they detected fraud or had good reason to suspect it. That very same year, SPR researchers Davy and Hodgson released another damning report entitled The Possibilities of Malobservation and Lapse of Memory from a Practical Point of View, in which they described a series of fake seances, with Davy pretending to be a medium and recreating all the tricks of the trade using the techniques of a stage magician in order to demonstrate that all the participants not only consistently attributed everything to spiritual phenomena, but also confabulated or fabricated memories, embellishing their accounts of what happened in the seances by inventing phenomena that hadn't actually occurred. It had been 40 years since the first rappings in Hydesville, New York. The practice of mediumship had exploded and spread around the world, and the claims of spiritualists and mediums had expanded to include an array of multiple proofs that the inhabitants of the spirit world were sending us messages and even interacting with the physical world. There had been skeptics as early as 1851, when the doctors associated with the University of Buffalo first suggested the Fox sisters were cracking joints to make their rappings. But the spiritualist movement had largely run roughshod over the forces of rationalism and science that had remade the world during the Age of Reason. Only 4 decades after the fact was the tide beginning to turn against spiritualists and mediums, who almost without exception were regularly exposed as confidence tricksters who collected money from seance participants eager to contact the dead, and then simply performed some parlor tricks from their growing repertoire of illusions. Some tricks, like spirit manifestations, were as simple as having an accomplice dressed in ghostly robes slip into the room to astonish seance participants. In the case of William Eglinton, who was known to materialize a spirit named Abdullah, psychical researchers simply seized the fellow, cut off a swatch of his robe, and later matched it to the costume, which they discovered in the medium's suitcase. Sometimes mediums made use of actual mechanical contraptions, attaching wires to tables and objects, or inflatable bladders in order to fake the spontaneous movements of things. Many of the tricks boiled down to sleight of hand. Mediums would use false thumbs and special gloves and slip their hand free from a seance participant's grip to manipulate the table or items on it. When practicing slate writing, it was a simple matter of switching out blank slates for slates with pre-written messages. Some used trick slates with secret flaps that hid the message inscribed there for a later reveal, while others would actually risk scribbling answers onto the slates during the seance, using thumb tip writers, rings with chalk attached, that they used to secretly write messages on the slates while handling them. Perhaps more impressive was the sleight of foot involved. Some mediums wrote on the slates beneath the table with their feet, hooked ankles around table legs to lift them, and of course, faked spirit wrappings with their feet. This had been suspected from the start. How easy it would have been for the Fox sisters to simply tap their toes or thump their heels against the ground to make their signature wrapping sounds. This is why early investigations had them stand on pillows. If foot tapping could not explain it, perhaps it was something else. The doctors from University of Buffalo believed they were popping the joints of their knees. When the Siebert Commission investigated Maggie Fox, they reported that the wrappings seemed to be coming from her feet or legs, and they could actually feel a pulsation in her feet when the wrappings occurred. The exact technique used remained a mystery, though, until a year after the Siebert Commission report, when Maggie Fox confessed that the entire phenomenon had been a hoax from the beginning. She and her sister Kate, who eventually joined in the confession as well, had started making noises in their Hydesville farm by dropping apples on the floor, and continued it later by tying apples to strings so they could cause their thumps on command. Eventually, they devised another way to produce wrapping sounds by cracking the joints of their big toes as well as their knees and ankles. They also thumped their toes against wooden floors by swishing them, much like one snaps their fingers. Lest anyone doubted, Maggie and Kate appeared publicly to demonstrate at the New York Academy of Music with doctors nearby to observe. Maggie cracked her toes on command, producing the spirit wrapping sounds that had launched her and her sisters' careers. The original matriarchs of the religion of spiritualism had revealed that they'd been false prophets all along, and that it had always only been a fraud. But like all false gospels, or to take it further, like all religions in general, being conclusively debunked did not stop people from continuing to place their faith in it. As we will see in part 2 of this series on the history of spiritualism. Thanks for listening to Historical Blindness. As always, special thanks go out to my partner patrons, Diane Lane, Joe Escott, Devlin Hoff, Lisa, Prickly Pear, Fred R. Grotice, Robin Naggett, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliette O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Christine LeBlanc, Lonnie C., Kaylee, Ama, Christopher L. Burton, Benny Slater, Chris BDG, Jocelyn Clausen, Lindsay McAllister, Brian, Jamie Nielsen, Martin Robistow, Josh Haberman, and AJ. I want to thank you partner patrons from the bottom of my heart for your continued support. Lately, I've seen patronage levels dropping a bit for whatever reason, but I continue to appreciate any and all support you offer to the show, especially you higher level patrons who have been so generous in your support. I'm working on sending out books to those of you who haven't received them. Make sure your physical address is current, and if you're a $5 patron who hasn't received their ebook yet, make sure you have a valid US email address on file so I can send you your ebook link. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and Who Did What Now. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel and by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes, or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, remember Brandolini's Law, or the bullshit asymmetry principle, which tells us that it takes far more time to refute falsehoods than it takes to invent and spread them. The story of the Fox sisters makes this clear. Their lie was refuted right away, but it continued to grow anyway, and those refuting it had to focus on disproving each subsequent further lie as they piled up. 40 years on, when the original liars came clean, even their own admission was not enough to kill the lie.